Welcome to the Killer Innovation Show, the longest continuously produced podcast in history. Each week, Phil McKinney brings you the insights and strategies to amplify your creativity and innovation skills. Here's your host, Phil McKinney.
Welcome to this week's Killer Innovations. This week's episode is based on an infographic that was sent to me. And this infographic listed out the 12 red flags for bad science. So how do you read an article? How do you read a research study and know whether or not you can or should trust the information? I am of the Ronald Reagan type of critical thinking, and that is trust but verify. In this case, this infographic I found really intriguing. I shared it out on my social media accounts, and a number of people commented on it or responded with a thumbs up. And so I thought I would dig into this a little bit deeper, going into a little bit more about each of these 12, giving you my perspective on what to look out for, not just giving you a list of 12 flags, but why? What's the motivation behind some of these things that lead to bad science? But also to give you more recent, real-world examples where that red flag was there and what the result was of that bad science, the downstream impact of either bad science or bad scientists. And also talk about what does good science look like? So that is what we're going to talk about. In my perspective, bad science can be a big problem, and it can cast doubts on the entire scientific process. Downstream, it impacts the innovation process. So my hope is out of today's show that by being more aware of the signs of bad science, we can avoid being misled by these studies. But we can also help to ensure that good science, good innovation is not tainted by bad data. And it's important to remember that science is an ever-evolving process. And therefore, being able to take a hard look, being analytical, being somewhat skeptical that we can, even with imperfect science, we can be willing to take the risk necessary to discover new scientific breakthroughs. So, before we jump into this week's episode, got that favor to ask, and that is to follow, like, and share. Follow on social media, be part of the conversation that could lead to future episodes. Like us, give us a thumbs up, give us a review, comment about the show, wherever it is you get the show. Spotify, iHeart, Apple, Google, any of the thousands of podcast sites. We're there. Give us a vote. Give us a thumbs up. Greatly appreciate it. And share this. If you've got people within your organization that you think could benefit from this conversation today, please share it with them. If you are part of the scientific community, share it with your colleagues. If you are at university, share it. This is an important topic around how do we maintain the integrity of the scientific process so that people can trust it, can trust the results, can trust the articles and information that get published. So today's topic is one I'm extremely passionate about, and hopefully after today's episode, it may open your eyes, but also help you look at the studies and research that you're reading in the news articles and in major publications to understand, is this factual? Can I trust it? Or should I be skeptical? So without any further ado, let's jump in to this week's episode. Science is a powerful tool. It has the ability to change the world, to improve our understanding of the universe we live in, and to help us find new and innovative ways to solve problems. But science is only as good as the data it uses, and bad science can lead us astray. Over the last few years, I've written several articles and recorded a similar number of podcasts on ethics related to science and innovation. Just as this is titled Bad Science, we could have titled it Bad Innovation. In this episode, we are going to explore how to determine whether the science you are reading is accurate or not. The inspiration for this episode came from an infographic created by Compound Interest. I've taken the list of ways to spot bad science from the infographic and created my own descriptions with examples that I think really reinforce the issue. But all credit for the list and the inspiration goes to Compound Interest, and I'll have a link in the show notes. So what are the 12 ways to spot bad science? Now, there are many ways to identify bad science studies and articles that publish the results, but here are the 12 most common. Be aware of these red flags, and you can protect yourselves from being misled or worse, using and repeating bad science. Number 1. Sensationalized headlines. Sensationalized headlines can be incredibly misleading. They often oversimplify the findings or worse, misrepresent them entirely. This can lead to bad decision making on the part of the reader and can ultimately have a negative impact. It's important to be discerning when reading articles about science to always consider the source of the information. Reputable sources will always aim to present accurate information, while less reputable sources may sensationalize the information to get more viewers, readers, and clicks. In the long run, this can muddy the waters and make it more difficult for people to discern what is actually true. An example of a sensationalized headline that was misleading would be the article, quote, "A new drug can cure alcoholism," end quote. This article was published by The Sun. The article claims that a new drug called Sensationalize can cure alcoholism, but that is not the case. Sensationalize is only approved for alcohol dependency, not alcoholism, and it does not cure addiction. Number 2. Misinterpreted results. Misinterpreted results can often lead to bad science and innovation. When research is reported in the media, it can be sensationalized or simplified in a way that distorts the actual findings. This can lead to poor decision making, again, based on inaccurate information. It's therefore important to read the original research in order to get an accurate understanding of what was actually studied. Only then can informed decisions be made about whether the findings apply to your own work, to your own efforts. One example of misinterpreted results would be the off-cited study that claiming eating chocolate can help you lose weight. This study, yes, it was an actual study, was later found to be flawed, and the author had to retract the findings. Number 3, conflict of interest. Science is often thought of as purely objective pursuit, unaffected by the biases and motivations of the people involved. However, scientists are people too, and their personal interests and agendas can influence them. This is known as a conflict of interest. A conflict of interest can distort scientific research and again lead to poor decision making. For example, a scientist might be more likely to publish results that support their theory or to downplay negative results. Conflicts of interest can also have a negative impact when it involves innovation. When innovators are seeking patents or commercial opportunities, they are less likely to share their findings with others. This can stifle innovation and prevent new ideas from being developed. Ultimately, it is important to recognize that conflict of interest exists, and we must take them into account when evaluating discoveries. It's also important to have transparent and accountable systems in place to manage for conflicts of interest. A recent example of a conflict of interest that impacted innovation is the Volkswagen emission scandal. In 2015, it was revealed that Volkswagen had been cheating on emission tests for its diesel cars. This was possible because Volkswagen had developed software that would turn off the emission controls when the car was being tested. This allowed the cars to pass the emission test, but when the cars were on the road, they emitted more pollutants than allowed. This scandal highlighted the importance of managing conflicts of interest to show how bad decisions can be made when scientists are not impartial. Number 4, correlation and causation. Science can be misused and abused by taking advantage of people's confusion between correlation and causation. Correlation is when two things happen together more often than would be expected by chance. For example, there is a correlation between ice cream sales and murders. When ice cream sales go up, so do murders. But that doesn't mean that eating ice cream causes people to murder others. There could be any number of other factors at work. Causation, on the other hand, means that one thing causes another. When we say that A causes B, it means that A always comes before B, and that by changing A, B will be changed. For example, we know that smoking causes cancer because smokers are more likely to get cancer than non-smokers. Changing the amount of smoking will change the amount of cancer. When two things appear to be correlated, it's important not to jump to conclusions and assume that one thing is causing the other. Without doing proper research and testing, bad science can result. So next time you hear about a scientific study that seems maybe a little too good to be true, be skeptical. One commercial example where correlation and causation can mislead the public is in using scientific studies to sell products. A study that shows a correlation between product and a positive outcome can persuade people to buy the product. But without knowing the full details of the study, it's hard to know if the product actually caused the correlation. For instance, there are numerous studies that show a correlation between eating breakfast and being thinner. So, many companies have started selling breakfast foods to help people lose weight. But does eating breakfast make you thinner? It's hard to say for sure because there's so many other factors at work. Maybe people who eat breakfast are more likely to be thinner overall, or maybe they're more likely to exercise in the morning. It's difficult to say for sure what's causing the correlation. Number 5, unsupported conclusions. Bad science can often come from unsupported conclusions. When a study jumps to a conclusion without proper evidence, it can be misleading and cause further bad science. This is because people may get the wrong idea about what the study found and try to build on that misconception. In some cases, this can even lead to lawsuits if people are injured by bad information that was based on bad science. It's therefore important that studies are very clear on what their evidence shows and what conclusions are still speculative. This allows people to better understand the research and prevents bad science from spreading any further. One recent example of bad science that was based on unsupported conclusions is the case of Theranos. This company claimed to have developed a new way to test blood that would require much less blood than traditional methods. However, after multiple retractions of their studies from industry papers, it was revealed that their technology didn't actually work. This led to massive financial losses for investors and for patients who trusted the company. Others who were attempting to follow in their footsteps found themselves back at the drawing board, wasting time and resources on something that was not possible. This is just one example of how bad science can have far-reaching consequences. Number 6, problem with sample size. A small sample size can lead to bad science for several reasons. First and foremost, when the sample size is small, it's more likely that the data will not represent the population. This means that any conclusions drawn from the data may be inaccurate. Additionally, small samples have less statistical power, meaning that they're less likely to detect differences between groups and/or identify significant results. This can lead to bad science in two ways. First, if researchers incorrectly conclude that there is no difference between groups when there is, and second, if researchers falsely deem a result statistically significant when it's not. Finally, small sample sizes can increase the chances of type 2 errors. Type 2 errors are false negatives, which means that bad science may be published because a true effect was missed due to the small sample size. In sum, all of these issues caused by small sample sizes can lead to faulty conclusions and bad science. One recent example of a research study based on small sample size that led to bad science is the study of the effect of fluoride on children's intelligence. The study had a small sample size, and as a result, the authors were not able to detect any significant difference between the fluoride and the placebo groups. This led to bad science as the authors incorrectly concluded that fluoride does not have an impact on children's intelligence. Number 7, underrepresentative samples used. Underrepresentative samples are often used in bad science experiments, which can eventually lead to absolutely disastrous conclusions. By using a non-representative sample, it's much easier to obtain results you're looking for because the data is guaranteed to be biased. When this happens, bad science perpetuates itself, and we often cannot trust any of the scientific findings. For example, a study that claims salt is bad for your health might be based on a sample of people who already have health problems. This would give the impression that salt is bad for everyone, when in reality, it might only be bad for people with certain conditions. If we rely on these kinds of studies to make decisions about our health, we could be doing ourselves a disservice. It's therefore important to always look at the methodology of a study before accepting its conclusions as fact. Only by doing so can we avoid being misled by bad science. Number 8, no control group used. The lack of a control group might throw the results of an experiment into doubt. It's critical to compare the outcomes from test participants who received the substance being tested to a control group that isn't receiving it in clinical trials. This allows researchers to see whether the drug made any difference. Random allocation of groups is also important in order to minimize bias. In experiments, it's important to have a control test where all variables are controlled. This allows researchers to isolate the effects of a single variable. Perhaps the most famous example of bad science without a control group is the case of thalidomide. This drug was marketed as a sedative for pregnant women in the 1950s and 60s. However, as a result of the small sample size, the world totally missed on the fact that the drug caused severe birth defects in thousands and thousands of children. Number 9, no blind testing used. By not blinding the test, research can introduce bias into a study. This can happen in different ways, such as research bias, subject bias, and observer bias. So what do I mean by this? Research bias happens when the researcher has a preconceived notion about the outcome of the study and influences how it is conducted or analyzed. Subject bias is when the subject knows which group they are in and alters their behavior because of it. For example, if someone knows they are in the test group using a new drug treatment and feels better than those in the control group, they may believe that the drug worked when in reality, maybe it didn't. Observer bias is when someone who is not involved in the study, such as maybe a friend or a family member of one of the participants, knows which group a participant is in and reports on their behavior differently based on that information. All of these types of bias can lead to inaccurate findings and conclusions in scientific studies. This can have far-reaching consequences, as bad science can be used to make recommendations or decisions about treatments, policies, etc. It's therefore important that scientists use a blind test whenever possible. One example of not using a blind test that caused future bad science is the Tuskegee syphilis study. In this study, 399 black men with syphilis were left untreated so that researchers can study the progression of the disease. Even after it was discovered that penicillin could cure the disease, the study continued for another 2 years. The lack of a blind test in this study led to biased results and further bad science. And number 10, selective reporting of data. When it comes to scientific research, the data collected should be unbiased and interpreted fairly. However, sometimes bad science is caused by researchers selectively reporting data. They simply review the data that supports their conclusion and ignore any information that does not. This can cause incorrect judgments and assertions. And the one way to avoid this issue is to always present all of the data collected, regardless of whether it supports your findings or not. This will help ensure that other researchers can interpret and analyze the data themselves and reach their own conclusions. It is important to be open and transparent about your research methods and results so that others can evaluate them for themselves. A recent example of bad science caused by selective reporting of data is the paper, quote, "The Mismeasure of Man," end quote, by Stephen Jay Gould. In this paper, Gould argues that intelligence tests are biased against certain groups of people, such as women and minorities. However, later research has shown that Gould selectively reported data to support his conclusions. For example, he ignored evidence that showed there was no significant difference in test scores between men and women. Number 11, unreproducible results. When research is not reproducible, it becomes difficult to verify the findings, which can create doubt about the entire study. This can lead to bad science, as scientists may accept bad data as fact. In short, reproducible research is essential for good science, and when research is not reproducible, it can lead to a variety of problems. One recent example of a study that was retracted because it could not be reproduced is the infamous South Korean stem cell study. In this study, researchers claimed to have created stem cells by using an entirely new method, but other scientists could not reproduce the results. As a result, the journal that originally published the study retracted it. Number 12, non-peer-reviewed material. The importance of using peer-reviewed studies cannot be overstated. By using these studies, researchers can be sure that the information they are getting is accurate and reliable. Studies that have not been peer-reviewed may be flawed and thus should be viewed potentially as being unreliable. This can lead to bad science and inaccurate information being spread when studies don't go through a peer review. Peer review is a critical step in the scientific process and helps to ensure that only the best research gets published. There have been recent rash of studies that were peer-reviewed, but that were also later retracted. It is not a perfect system, but it is the best we have today. To avoid bad science, researchers should always look for peer-reviewed studies when possible. One example of a study that was peer-reviewed but later retracted is the infamous study on climate change by Dr. Michael Mann. The study, which was published in 1999, purported to show a correlation between climate change and the increase in global temperatures. However, the study was later retracted after it was revealed that the data had been manipulated. It had been fraudulently created. These kinds of retractions of peer-reviewed studies put all other studies into question. It puts all of science into question. It is hard to know which studies to trust when bad science like this makes its way into the peer-reviewed process itself. So, again, let's run through these real quick. 1, sensationalized headlines. Want to avoid those. 2, misinterpreted results. Make sure you look at the study and come to your own conclusions. 3, conflicts of interest. Number 4, correlation and causation. Understanding the difference, not getting confused. 5, unsupported conclusions. Don't jump to conclusions. Make sure they are supported by the results. Number 6, problem with sample size. Small sample size leads to bias in the results. Number 7, unrepresentative samples used. Make sure the samples are conclusive to include the population that you're looking at, whether it be market research or scientific studies. Number 8, no control groups used. Again, one of the key clues to leading to bias. Number 9, no blind testing. Use blind testing. Double blind is even better to where the researcher doesn't even know who has it. Number 10, selective reporting of data. Cherry picking data is really driven by finding the data that best fits the curve or fits that hypothesis. Number 11, unreproducible results. If the research cannot be reproduced, then that should be an immediate flag. And then number 12, non-peer-reviewed material. Studies that are making strong, bold claims should have, 1, be reproducible, and 2, non-peer, or should be peer-reviewed in order to support those activities. Now, those are the 12 of that are the flags that you should be on the lookout to make sure that you can identify those that maybe are suspect, that maybe aren't complete. But let's keep in mind, science is a process of exploration and discovery. When bad science occurs, it can cast a doubt on all the findings of that study, as well as on the entire scientific process. However, by being aware of the signs of bad science, we can avoid being misled by these studies. We can also help to ensure that good science is not tainted by bad data. It is important to remember that science is an evolving process. For instance, the retracted South Korean stem cell study, for example, may have been flawed, but it led to new discoveries about stem cells that could not have been made otherwise. In this way, even bad science can be valuable in helping us to learn more about the world around us. We should not give up on science just because of bad science or bad scientists. Instead, we should use bad science as a learning experience and continue to keep ourselves motivated to continue to explore and discover new truths. We need to work together to recognize and reward good science while calling out bad science so that we can ensure the best information to which to make informed decisions about our future. So which of the 12 is one that you have seen in a recent study? One that is a flag that was quite obvious in a study, whether that be around innovation, science, whatever, where someone was trying to convey something that was inaccurate. My wife is a nurse, and she and I were having a conversation recently. She follows a lot of medical research studies. She's always interested in new pharmaceuticals and new things that would have an impact. And one of the studies that she had gotten involved in, I did a little bit of research on and found out that research study had been retracted. There's actually a website that I follow that lists every research study that has ever been retracted and any author that has had a study retracted. And I'll put a link in the show notes so that you can find it, or you can just search for it in Google. You should be able to find it pretty quickly. But in the case of this study, they published the study. People got really excited. Some other scientists tried to reproduce it, and they could not reproduce it. Given the data that was in it, the images that were presented in the paper, and all of the information, another scientist could not produce the same results. And that's what caused that study to be retracted. And so therefore, what does that mean? That means people could have based the development of new drugs or a certain path of research, or other scientists could have said, whoa, this is an interesting new area. I'm going to commit my PhD or my research studies, and all of a sudden have it blow up in their face because some scientist cooked the books, faked the data, faked the image, which tends to be a really popular thing in studies. And in fact, if you look at the escalating growth in retracted research studies, it is mind-boggling. Every year, more studies are retracted than the previous year, and it's accelerating. There's a lot of pressure for researchers. It's the publish or perish. So the stress to publish causes some of them to push the ethical boundaries, cook the data, manipulate the data to drive to a certain conclusion. But the problem is downstream, other scientists will set their agenda based on findings earlier. So that is why I am spending so much time in today's episode wanting to arm all of us to be somewhat skeptical and being able to be skilled in distinguishing between good science and bad science. But most importantly, it's our willingness to call it out, reward good science, and call out bad science, such that we can make better decisions, because better decisions today impact our lives, our children's lives, and our grandchildren's lives. With that, we're going to wrap up today's show. Thank you for taking the time to be with us here today. I know time is your most valuable asset, and I greatly appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to be here today. I would love to see hear your feedback, your comments. Is there a 13th, 14th, or 15th red flag that we should be adding to the list? Do you have maybe even some better examples that I gave in today's show about bad science, where things should have popped a flag, but it got published or it got used, or businesses got established when they should not have been done? Would love to hear from you. Post them in the show comments, or just send them to me via the contact connection over on the websites. So with that, thank you again out of your busy schedule. Hopefully you found today's show informative, and stay tuned as we will be back again with another episode of Killer Innovations. Have a great week. Work on your ideas and go out and change the world. Bye-bye.
Podcasting nonstop since 2005, this has been the Killer Innovation Show on the Innovators Network.